The Forgotten Soldier Who Stopped World War III story. The true story of Vasili Arkhipov, the Soviet naval officer who refused to launch a nuclear torpedo during the Cuban Missile Crisis, preventing a possible world war. In October 1962, the world came closer to nuclear war than at any other point in history. Yet almost no one knows the name of the man who stopped it. Picture this: sirens blaring across military bases, U.S. warships circling Cuba, and Soviet submarines lurking silently beneath the waves. Above ground, leaders traded threats. Underground, families built fallout shelters. The fate of millions, balanced on decisions made in minutes. And in the chaos of the Cuban Missile Crisis, one Soviet officer, Vasili Arkhipov, made a choice that would prevent World War III. While politicians argued in Washington and Moscow, Arkhipov sat in the suffocating darkness of a submarine, faced with a decision that could ignite nuclear fire across the globe. But before we get to that critical moment, you need to understand just how dangerously close the world already was to destruction. For 13 days in October 1962, the world held its breath, because one wrong move meant nuclear annihilation. The United States had discovered Soviet nuclear missiles secretly installed in Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida. American reconnaissance planes flew low over the island, photographing missile sites being prepared for launch. On television, President John F. Kennedy warned the nation of a clear and present danger, while in Moscow, Nikita Khrushchev insisted the missiles were a defensive shield. Across both countries, tension was unbearable. In Washington, generals urged a full-scale invasion of Cuba. In Moscow, commanders demanded the Navy stand ready to defend the motherland. Ordinary people stocked food, water, and supplies, convinced that tomorrow might never come. The planet had never been so close to the edge of self-destruction, and deep below the waves, a Soviet submarine named B-59 was about to become the flashpoint. Let's step inside that submarine and see how desperation and confusion pushed its crew toward a fateful decision. Beneath the rolling waves of the Caribbean, the Soviet submarine B-59 was a floating pressure cooker, sealed in steel, starved of air, and surrounded by enemies. Inside, temperatures soared above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The crew, drenched in sweat, struggled to breathe as oxygen grew thin, and the hum of machinery rattled their nerves. They hadn't surfaced in days, cut off from Moscow, with no idea if war had already begun. Above them, U.S. Navy ships dropped practice depth charges, explosions that thundered against the hull like a drumbeat of doom. To the men inside, each blast felt like a countdown to destruction. Panic spread. Some believed nuclear war had already erupted, and their orders might be to strike back. In the command room, senior officers debated the unthinkable. Arming their single nuclear torpedo, two were ready to approve its launch. Only one man's voice remained between restraint and catastrophe. That man was Vasili Arkhipov, and in the next moment, his decision would determine whether the world burned or survived. In the stifling control room of the B-59, three men held the power to unleash a nuclear strike, and two had already voted yes. The submarine's commander, Valentin Savitsky, furious and convinced that war had already begun, ordered the nuclear torpedo prepared. His political officer, Ivan Maslenikov, backed him without hesitation. The weapon was capable of wiping out an entire U.S. aircraft carrier group, an act that would almost certainly trigger full-scale nuclear war. But there was a rule. All three senior officers had to agree before the torpedo could be launched. The final word belonged to Vasili Arkhipov. Sweat dripped down faces as the submarine shuddered from more explosions above. Every man in that cramped chamber felt the pressure, fear, anger, duty, and survival all colliding in a single instant. Arkhipov listened to the demands of his comrades, but his instincts screamed caution. Launching meant global destruction. Refusing meant defying his superior officer in the heat of crisis. The world now hung on Arkhipov's judgment, and what he chose next would change history forever. In that sweltering chamber, with the world on the brink, Vasili Arkhipov did the unthinkable. He said no. As alarms echoed and the submarine groaned under the weight of depth charges, Arkhipov stood his ground. His commander raged, his comrades pleaded, but Arkhipov refused to authorize the launch. Calm and unwavering, he argued that there was no proof of an actual attack, that to fire now would guarantee disaster on a scale beyond imagination. In that moment, his voice was more than dissent. It was a lifeline for humanity. The launch order was abandoned. The nuclear torpedo stayed locked inside its casing, silent in the shadows of the submarine. Billions of lives, though they would never know it, were spared because one man's courage outweighed the fury of war. But history rarely celebrates restraint. So what became of Arkhipov after this life-saving stand? When the B-59 finally surfaced and the crisis subsided, the world never knew how close it had come to destruction, nor the man who had quietly saved it. Arkhipov and his crew returned to the Soviet Union, not as heroes, but in silence. The incident was buried in secrecy, hidden behind Cold War politics. Officially, nothing had happened. There were no medals, no speeches, no public recognition, only quiet dismissal from superiors who viewed the submarine's near mutiny as a stain on discipline. For decades, his story remained unknown, overshadowed by the larger drama of Kennedy and Khrushchev. Only after the collapse of the Soviet Union did documents reveal the truth, that the restraint of one naval officer had likely prevented nuclear war. But history is written not only in silence, it is shaped by the weight of a single choice. And Arkhipov's decision leaves us with a powerful legacy still relevant today. One quiet decision in the depths of the ocean proved stronger than the roar of missiles and the rage of nations. Vasili Arkhipov never sought fame, but his refusal to launch that torpedo spared humanity from nuclear war. His story reminds us that history doesn't always turn on presidents or generals. It can hinge on the courage of a single individual willing to stand against the tide. Today, scholars call him the man who saved the world. Yet outside of history circles, his name is still rarely known. His legacy is not carved in statues or etched on monuments, but in the billions of lives that continue because of his restraint. Arkhipov's choice teaches us that true heroism is not always loud. It is often quiet, principled, and unseen. And in a world that still lives under the shadow of nuclear weapons, his story is a warning and a beacon of hope. And now, knowing this hidden chapter of history, the question remains, how many other untold stories of forgotten heroes are still waiting to be uncovered? If you want to join us in uncovering those forgotten stories, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell.